Hi horror fans, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into Scream 2, the sequel that slashed its way to theaters in 1997, continuing the legacy of the original. The sequel arrived less than a year after the original film's massive success. Is it still meta and terrifying, or does it fall into the traps that sequels are notorious for? Let's break it down. Scream 2 picks up after the events of the first film, with Sidney Prescott, played by Neve Campbell, now in college, and trying to move on from the horrific murders in Woodsboro. But of course, a new Ghostface emerges to terrorize Sidney and her friends once again in another bloody killing spree. One of the things that makes Scream 2 so unique is its meta-narrative. Randy Meeks, played by Jamie Kennedy, famously lays out the rules of sequels in a classroom scene that's almost as iconic as his horror movie survival rules in the first film. It's this self-awareness that makes the Scream series stand out. The movie isn't just a slasher, it's also a commentary on the state of horror in the 90s and how sequels often falter in trying to live up to the original. It's smart without being smug, and Scream 2 manages to walk that fine line. Now let's talk about the cast. Let's get into the performances. Neve Campbell once again shines as Sidney Prescott, and what's great about her character in Scream 2 is that she's visibly grown since the first film. She's no longer just the traumatized high school girl from Woodsboro. Now she's a college student, more hardened but still vulnerable. Neve brings a quiet strength to Sidney that makes her not just a survivor, but a fighter. You feel her exhaustion from the trauma she's been through, yet you root for her even harder because she's not backing down from Ghostface. Courtney Cox, as Gale Weathers, is even more ruthless in this sequel. But what's interesting about Gale in Scream 2 is that we get to see a more human side of her. Her relationship with David Arquette's Dewey is complicated. There's real chemistry there, but it's also weighed down by her career ambitions and his lingering distrust of her. Dewey remains the heart of the series. David Arquette plays him with such sincerity, and his loyalty to Sidney and his awkward charm really stand out. Despite his injuries from the first film, Dewey refuses to back down from the fight, giving the character an endearing sense of resilience. And then we have Sarah Michelle Gellar as Cece. What's fascinating is that Gellar signed onto the film without even reading the script. This just shows how eager actors were to be part of the Scream phenomenon. Gellar was already riding high on the success of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and while her role is relatively small, she makes an impact. The tension in her scene is palpable, and even though she's a quick victim of Ghostface, she brings real terror and energy to that brief but memorable role. This eagerness wasn't limited to Gellar. Actors were lining up to be part of Scream 2. After the massive success of the original, the sequel attracted big names like Jerry O'Connell, Timothy Olyphant, and Laurie Metcalf. O'Connell plays Sidney's new boyfriend, Derek, and while he's not as complex as some of the other characters, his charm and the chemistry with Neve Campbell work well. Timothy Olyphant, who plays Mickey, delivers a performance that toes the line between friend and potential suspect, keeping you guessing throughout the film. And Laurie Metcalf? What a standout. Her portrayal of Debbie Salt, the nosy reporter, feels like a slow burn until we hit the explosive final act. When it comes to the kill scenes in Scream 2, Wes Craven doesn't hold back. The film amps up the violence compared to the first movie, delivering some truly memorable moments. Let's start with the opening kill, an audacious and clever scene set in a packed movie theater during a screening of Stab, the film within a film based on the events of the first Scream. Jada Pinkett Smith's character, Maureen, finds herself brutally murdered in front of a crowd that mistakes her real-life screams for part of the show. It's a harrowing moment because of the sheer chaos of it all. The audience wearing Ghostface masks, the fact that no one realizes what's happening until it's too late. Craven plays with the idea of spectacle and violence, making us question whether anyone really knows what's real anymore. Then there's the death of Cece, played by Sarah Michelle Gellar. Cece, alone in her sorority house, gets a call from Ghostface, and we all know where that's going. The tension builds with every second. Cece running upstairs instead of out the front door, the classic mistake we always yell at characters for. When Ghostface finally catches her, tossing her off the balcony after a vicious knife attack, it's a stark reminder of Craven's knack for turning seemingly safe spaces, like a college sorority, into sites of horror. But perhaps the most heartbreaking and shocking kill in Scream 2 is Randy's death. Randy was the heart of the first film with his love of horror movies, and his encyclopedic knowledge of the genre's rules. In Scream 2, Randy gets a similar role, offering commentary on the rules of sequels. But this time, he isn't so lucky. His death scene is brutal and unexpected, occurring in broad daylight right in the middle of campus. The fact that most of these deaths occur in public or safe spaces makes them feel more tragic. In the final act, the action moves to the stage of the college auditorium. The first killer to be revealed is Mickey. Unlike the other killers, Mickey wants to be arrested for his crimes. Mickey's motivation adds a fresh layer of meta-commentary, as he plans to blame horror films for his actions, turning his trial into a media spectacle. It's another jab at the media's obsession with violence and celebrity culture, themes that Scream 2 keeps bringing back. Mickey tries to convince Sidney that Derek is his accomplice, echoing the betrayal Sidney experienced with Billy in the first movie. This scene is heartbreaking because we can see Sidney's inner conflict. She's scarred by her past and unsure if she can trust Derek, despite his pleas of innocence. Sidney hesitates, and that moment of doubt costs Derek his life. Mickey shoots him, revealing that Derek was, in fact, innocent all along. This adds another layer of tragedy to Sidney's story. Her inability to trust ultimately leads to her boyfriend's death, deepening her trauma. But the bigger shock comes when we discover that Debbie Salt, the pushy reporter who's been hanging around the whole film, is Mrs. Loomis, Billy Loomis's mother from the first movie. Laurie Metcalf is excellent in this role, transitioning from a seemingly harmless reporter into a cold-blooded killer with a personal vendetta against Sidney. Mrs. Loomis's motivation for revenge ties the film back to the events of the original Scream, reminding us how the past continues to haunt Sidney. After Derek's death, Sidney's survival instincts kick in, and she uses the stage's props to outwit both Mickey and Mrs. Loomis. There's a great moment where Sidney drops a stage prop onto Mrs. Loomis, temporarily incapacitating her, showcasing Sidney's quick thinking. The final twist comes when Cotton Weary, played by Liev Schreiber, shows up. Cotton has his own motives. He's still bitter about being wrongfully accused of murdering Sidney's mother, but in this moment, he chooses to help Sidney, killing Mrs. Loomis and saving Sidney's life. Cotton's ambiguous character arc adds tension to the ending, as we're never quite sure if he's fully trustworthy. While Scream 2 is a strong sequel in many ways, it isn't without its flaws. The killer reveal had big shoes to fill, compared to the previous film. While Mrs. Loomis's motivation works on paper, it feels a little far-fetched. The fact that no one recognizes her, even though she's been lurking around campus as a reporter, can feel a bit hard to believe, even for a movie that's built on suspension of disbelief. And as much as Timothy Olyphant brings energy to the role of Mickey, his character is underdeveloped compared to the original film's killers, Billy and Stu. Mickey's motivation feels a little rushed, and we don't get to know him well enough for the twist to land with the same impact. Scream 2 manages to be a rare sequel that holds its own against the original. If you loved the first one, Scream 2 is definitely worth your time. What did you think of Scream 2? Please give this video a like and subscribe for more horror movie reviews. And remember, stay safe and stay spooky.